let's start with Iran. The number who support the fighting in Iran has fallen to 33%. That's the lowest yet on record. It's down 3 points from a week ago. Remember, early in the conflict, the number had been hovering around 39 to 40% just about every week, and it's been slipping lately. I think it's just a general weariness about the war. One group where enthusiasm has not slipped. On the day the bombing began, 76% of those who prefer Trump-like policies supported the attacks. In our most recent survey, 77% support the attacks. In fact, the number who have a very favorable opinion of it is up 5 points. So the Trump base is remaining solidly behind the president's activities, but just about everybody else is seeing some decline in support. I think it's also worth noting that the size of the Trump base has been shrinking a little bit. 38% of voters said they liked Trump-like policies when the president first took office. It fell to the low 30s just before the war began in Iran. It's down to about 28% now. So the base is solid, but perhaps some of the people who would have been disenchanted have simply decided they're not part of his base anymore. A couple of other notes on this. 40% of voters now tell us that they believe Iran was a nuclear threat, a national security threat to the United States before the war began. 40% now, that's down from 48% when the fighting began. On a similar vein, 53% now say it's likely that Iran was close to developing a nuclear weapon that could reach the U.S. But now that number is down 10 points as well. So again, a general weariness with the war, general decline in support, and a reevaluation of the reasons that were there. Now, let's move on to taxes. No surprise, overwhelmingly, voters think American taxes are too high. 85% say that. 49% say they're much too high when we ask about how much they're paying. 45% of voters, nearly half, say they're paying more than their fair share. Another 45% say about their fair share, and 4%, only 4%, saying they're really paying less than they should. What's interesting about these numbers is not that people think taxes are too high, because people always think taxes are too high. It's that they have these views while they underestimate how much they're paying in taxes. The average American pays about 35% of their income in taxes to federal, state, and local governments combined. And yet a majority of voters, 56%, say they pay less than 25%. And by the way, that perception applies to all income brackets. People who make more than $150,000 a year or less than $50,000 a year, most of them all estimate that they're paying less than 25% of their income in taxes, when in fact the average payment is about 10 points higher. You get into this discussion a little bit deeper and you see some other contradictions. Turns out that a majority of voters would like to see a limit on how much the federal or how much governments could collect in taxes from all of us. A solid majority say the government should never be allowed to take more than 40% of a person's income in taxes. Well, if that were to happen, there'd be a huge tax cut for a lot of upper income Americans. How can you have views like that at the same time people are saying we should raise taxes on the wealthy? It's pretty simple. It's because 7 out of 10 voters believe that the rich are paying a smaller share of their income in taxes than middle class Americans. So again, you get into this dynamic where people think they're underestimating their own taxes. They think wealthy people are paying even less. Most people don't think anybody pays, or don't think they pay more than 25% of their income in taxes. 40% seems like a pretty high threshold at that point, but it would be a radical change. The point of all this, when we talk about tax policy, it's very important to remember most people have no real understanding of the dynamics. I think the most important thing to hammer home is that most people pay more in taxes than they think. Finally, we're going to take a look at the who decides question. In our polling on the data centers recently, we showed that 67% of voters think regulations and rules should be set by state and local governments. Just 25% think the Fed should set the rules. No surprise, voters always want decision making closer to home. But one of the things that gets lost in all this discussion, it almost sounds like a process argument about government and who has the legal right to do this or that. The importance of the who decides question has a lot to do with accountability. Voters don't have much control over federal government officials or state government officials, a little bit more with their local officials, and they certainly interact with them more, but they don't have the ability to hold governments accountable. Voters do recognize, however, the way incentives work. 73% of voters believe it makes sense for a business owner to leave a state. If his state has higher taxes, it can go to a lower tax state. Nearly as many say, of course it makes sense to move your business from a high cost of living area to a low cost of living area. Most voters, by a 2-to-1 margin, say, well, if you disagree with the policies of the state's political leaders, yeah, that's a good reason to move your business, especially if those policies relate to the business. And a solid plurality of 48% say, even if you disagree with the political policies on things that have nothing to do with your business, you should feel free to move. Bottom line is, people recognize that decisions made by political leaders create rational reasons for business leaders and others to either remain in the state or leave the state, to remain in one state or move to another that has more favorable positions. And that dynamic is why the who decides question is so important. It is a way to hold political leaders accountable.